My story with Outward is an interesting one. I wanted to play it with my wife a few months back. We had heard some good things about it, but also that it can be a bit overwhelming at first. We're both experienced RPG players, so a steep learning curve was not going to discourage us. The thing we were most worried about was the game's graphics and the fact that they're pretty ugly. We made our characters and started the game nonetheless. Yes, it was ugly and felt clunky as hell, but we all know that when it comes to RPGs, the graphics are hardly the most important thing. Within the first few minutes, it also became clear that the game's budget had not been enough for the voice acting, which was mostly cut. Almost nothing's voice acted, so we'd have to read all the conversations. To make a long story short, we went out of town, were attacked by two bandits, got killed instantly. I'm usually not the kind of person to give up on a game, but there were a few other ones waiting for me, which simply looked better at that point, so that was where we decided to skip this one. It just seemed like there were too many things that bothered us at the time. 3 months later, we decided to give it another chance, but this time we would play the tutorial and watch a few videos on YouTube beforehand. Even so, it was still a bit overwhelming, but with patience you can actually get into it and then the game becomes quite fun. After 60 hours, I'm ready to tell you what I think of Outward and its DLC, so without further ado, let's dive right into it. As usual, we will start by talking about the Ultrawide Support. Both 21:9 and 32:9 are supported here, no need to modify anything. As for the graphics, I mean, you can see for yourself that the game was made on a super tight budget. It's made using the Unity engine, which is often a red flag these days. I've seen my share of asset flips with it, just take a look at my shiny shitty games reviewed playlist. Still, while the game may look rough, it can have its moments as well. The colors are nice, the different areas can have various weather effects, and overall, the more you play it, the less you notice all the rough edges. On top of that, the game supports both online multiplayer as well as split screen, which is awesome. I wish we'd see more games with split screen support. You can even set up the correct gamepad layout for the split screen partner so that they get the correct prompts, and it is actually playing really well with a gamepad, I gotta tell you that. It's interesting, you just select if you want to play using a PlayStation gamepad or an Xbox gamepad, and you even get the prompts with the specific indications correctly. Especially on account of how the combat system can at times resemble Dark Souls, this gamepad support is actually probably gonna be preferable to some people than using a keyboard and mouse. We still stuck to that, but I'm just saying that some people like it a lot. In terms of bugs, there were a few, some of which were really annoying. For one, I got stuck in a rock and would not be able to get out for whatever I do. Even logging out and then back in would simply spawn me on the same spot. I had to check online and it seems there's a hidden button combination which allows the player to kill themselves. That's the only way out. My wife, on the other hand, experienced a weird bug where all the stacks in her inventory were reset to just one item, meaning that if she had 4 stacks with 15 arrows each, after the bug she had 4 stacks with 1 arrow each, and this applied to all items in her inventory. Everything was just slashed down to a single item. Needless to say, this was pretty terrible because some of the items in her inventory were very valuable and now they were slashed. She had only one of them instead of whatever the stack's actual size was. Something that bothered me from the start was that playing in multiplayer comes at an expense of the player who has joined the game. My first main issue is that the loot is global, meaning that if there is an item, you have to share it between the two players. You have to make up your mind who is going to get the item because you both see that one specific item, which when compared to instance loot, like in many other games, where every player gets their own unique loot, can be a bit annoying. The second and main issue here is that the second player gains nothing from the quest progressions. Oftentimes, the story quests will give you a passive skill as a reward. This only applies to the host though. The joining player gets nothing. I would have preferred if the joining player had the option to merge their world with the one of the host, meaning that all decisions applied there would also be applied to the second player, and thus they would receive their same rewards. I read some forums and most players who play Outward together do exactly as we did. They play together from start to finish. It's not something that each of them goes in their game and they just play a little bit and sometimes they join a random player. No, they start together and they play the whole time together. So this actually is punishing such players, which are again the majority of the people on multiplayer from what I've observed. There is no need for the second player to have individual story and mission progress in this case, simply because they will usually not play on their own, as stated. The same happens with bosses. You kill the boss together, but only the host gets the drop. That's not so bad though, since you can freely drop all items and gear and another player can simply pick them up, and this can happen at any point. There's no timer restricting that, nothing. So that's not that big of a problem. And speaking of progression, let me tell you about the game's leveling system. It has none. Yep, your stats can be improved through skills, which you will learn from trainers around the world. Each character starts with 3 special points called breakthrough points. Think of them as skill points points that are used to unlock special locked skill trees. When you go to a trainer, he will have a skill tree for you to learn. The first few skills from that tree only require money in order to unlock. If you want to unlock the more advanced skills, however, you need to spend one of your breakthrough points for that trainer in order to make it possible. This means that you can only learn the advanced skills of 3 trainers throughout the world, and it's especially bad that there is absolutely no way of respecking afterwards. You can't just reset your skills and get the points back and just try again. This is especially bad since the game's world is somewhat large and players start without knowing any of this. The starting city has a trainer with skills, which are mostly useless in my personal opinion. However, unless you start watching YouTube videos on the topic of skills, you will not know what skills await you throughout the world. You will almost certainly use one of your 3 precious breakthrough skills with that particular first trainer just so you can get some kind of abilities, only to realize much later in the game that these skills are not very good. Effectively, unless you really learn a lot about the game in advance, you will fall victim to its complexity and above all to the fact that it's all so cryptic during your first playthrough. And that simply sucks. Outward offers a lot of replayability, primarily with the fact that you have 3 different main quest branches. Selecting one automatically excludes the other 2, meaning that you need to replay the game at least 3 times in order to see all of it. Additionally, there are special chests found throughout the game called legacy chests. These allow you to place one item which can then be looted from another character during a different playthrough. Some items even become stronger when this is done. This inherently adds to the game's replayability, but that's still not an excuse for the fact that your first playthrough will mostly be really hard due to the complexity of the game and its lack of information. Something that I did like was how the game handles all the dropped items and dead creatures. As you play, in-game time passes. If you drop some items, they will never disappear. You can come back a week later and they will still be there. The mobs will respawn after some time as well, but that can take in-game days to happen. This means that having cleared a dungeon or a path has meaning. If you don't wait too long, you can use the now clear opening and do your quests in peace. I find it very annoying when a game respawns the enemies a short time after I have just cleared them. This is doubly true in games where the combat is challenging, so every fight can cost you a lot. If you've played Subnautica, you'll probably remember how the game becomes heavier as the time passes and the loading screens get longer and longer due to the fact that it too would allow your items which were dropped to remain forever on the map. Unlike Subnautica, however, this game's world is divided in instances. Every city, every dungeon, and the open sections of the world are all individual instances divided by a loading screen. This way you can pollute as much as you like without consequences. There is no need to worry about getting longer loading times here since they already are long. Can't ruin short loading screens if you don't have them in the first place. But memes aside, it's true, my game is installed on an NVMe SSD and it still takes 10 seconds on average to load each territory when I'm crossing in between. Luckily the instances are large enough so that once you enter them, you will likely spend a while before you need to go out again, meaning that the loading screens are at least relatively far apart. Let's talk about the game's survival aspects. This game has them and they are no joke. Your character needs to eat, drink, sleep, and also pay attention to the temperature as well to the diseases and various status effects that they can contract. This is also one of the main reasons why your backpack will be full with various potions for the majority of the game, and that can be quite annoying, but it is what it is. You have to be prepared to counter these effects, otherwise they will kill you. Getting food and water is not hard, the game provides you with lots of both, but the weather can be a real pain, especially since it doesn't conform to logic. Let me explain. In games like Conan Exiles, if you are hot, you can simply remove your warm clothes, and thus you will not be as hot. In Outward, the game handles this differently. Everything here is rough around the edges. Heat is just a stat and the game does not apply logic to it. If your clothes have no temperature resistance, then taking them off makes absolutely no difference. I have an armor which actually gives me minus 20% resistance to hot weather, so it actually harms me if it's hot. By applying logic, this means that the armor itself is warm, so being in the heat makes things worse, same as if you wore a winter jacket on a hot summer day. This would mean that if I wore the same armor in cold weather, I should be able to receive a 20% resistance to cold effect, right? That's how it would be in Conan Exiles and in the real world. The winter jacket is pretty useful on a cold day, but that is not how it works in Outward. If there's no stat that makes you receive cold weather resistance, then you simply don't. So wearing that same armor during cold weather is literally the same as wearing no armor and just walking around naked. My character freezes just as fast, not to mention that he also catches the common cold, for which I have to use one of my tea types or a magic potion in order to cure him, since food and tea are much more easily and readily available in the game than special potions. That is usually what you will use, and it takes quite a few in-game hours for the cure to actually fix your cold, meaning that I will be walking around with a debuff for a while. That just shows you how applying logic from other games in real life will not work with most of this game's mechanics. The steep learning curve remains a problem for most of your playthrough, and since I'm talking about the survival mechanics, there is a particular one which I really dislike. With the introduction of the Soroborians DLC, a new area was implemented with new items, new enemies, bosses, and various other things, one of which is the corruption effect. This effect stacks when you get hit by a certain demonic enemy or if you stand in corruption pools. The issue is, the game really doesn't show you in any way besides a stat called corruption that you are being corrupted. You gain it fairly quickly, especially in later stages of the main story, and you suffer various debuffs from it, starting at 25% corruption. The debuffs get worse with each 25% on top, and curing it is only possible with special potions, which can either drop or be crafted. Both of these, however, only while playing the new DLC map. The issue with that is that the DLC map is designed as an end game area. The enemies are hard, the bosses are very challenging. In other words, you can gain corruption anywhere, even as early as the beginning of the game, but healing it is something you can only do at the end. And if you decide to, for some reason, go to the end game area earlier, which is pretty easy because you can just talk to a caravan master and he will take you there, you are now faced with a quest that immediately starts upon your arrival and gives you a certain timeline. It says, if you do not complete me within this time, bad things are gonna happen. So if you go there early and you're weak, you now have to do this really difficult quest with strong enemies and bosses, which you might even not be ready to be able to do, meaning that you will fail and you will suffer some kind of negative consequences. To be quite honest, I don't know what they are. I haven't read about it. I actually managed to do it because my wife and I went there when we were pretty much decked out, but still, that's simply bad gameplay design right there. And let's not forget that in most cases, the player is not warned of it. There are random cracks in the terrain with green smoke coming out of them. Standing next to them seems to do absolutely nothing, but in actuality it increases your corruption. A new player has no way of knowing this since the game doesn't bother to show it in any way. It's yet another trap set for the first playthrough, and I don't appreciate it. As for the combat, it's quite fun, although it can be a bit stiff at times. Some enemies will literally fire projectiles at you while you are behind their backs, which is simply put unfair, and that's not something that the enemy should be able to do. You see them aim forward, but the projectile simply flies back. A Manticore boss killed me like that. The combat can sometimes feel similar to Dark Souls, but a bit more simplistic in a way. You can block attacks, you can parry by timing your skills with incoming attacks, etc. Fighting multiple opponents is really difficult and requires a good strategy, especially if you play by yourself. The main issue here is that you get nothing outside of loot for fighting, and said loot is often not useful to you. Due to the carrying capacity restrictions, hoarding is almost never an option. So oftentimes, avoiding a fight is smarter than engaging the enemy. Playing in co-op makes things easier though, and I personally find avoiding fights boring, so my wife and I went for anything that moves, which caused us to die a few times. Death in this game is a narrative experience. During the loading screen, you get a message and various things can happen. They determine where you will awaken as well. Sometimes you get saved by an unknown benefactor and you wake up at a campsite. Other times the monster which defeated you drags you further into the dungeon and you appear in a cave, and other similar things. That's quite original, and I appreciate the fantasy put into it. It would have been so much better if it had all been voiced rather than just given to you as plain text, but perhaps in the sequel. Finally, I want to complain about the game's lack of fast travel. The world is somewhat large, and the main quests will at times ask you to travel between several territories only to talk to someone and then go back from where you came from. That's a lot of boring legwork, and not to mention the loading screens. Another hidden trap for new players becomes clear if you get distracted during your travels and decide to raid some dungeons along the way in order to make the trip more fun. This is dangerous because some quests have hidden timers. If you take too long, you will be late and get a bad ending for the quest, meaning that you receive lesser rewards and in some cases have to do more work in order to resolve things. I think the idea behind that is very original, but the issue at hand is that sometimes the text of the quest doesn't actually indicate the urgency in any way. They tell you something like, go there and do that, and that's it. I feel like saying, you have to hurry, time is of the essence, or any moment you wait could mean death for the person you're supposed to find. Something like that would really have given the player a hint that they should not waste time. I did mention the DLC quest that starts once you enter the DLC territory. That one actually straight out tells you you have 60 days. So I'm going to assume they realized that this is a bit of a problematic situation and they should give a bit more information and fixed it for the DLC. Good on them. I hope that they continue learning from their mistakes for a potential next game. So as you can see, Outward has tons of problems. It's definitely not a game for everyone, but it does have its positive sides too, and I want to talk about them now. First of all, the music is really nice. There aren't many songs, but what's there is all great. It's perfect for motivating you to go out on an adventure in a magical world. Secondly, once you watch some YouTube videos and get a feeling for how the world operates, as well as some grasp of the basics, it actually becomes quite fun. Especially when the experience is shared with a friend, the enjoyment increases exponentially. Not to mention that the difficulty drops as well, since you can be revived if you die by your friend and immediately get back in the fight. Outward's world can feel empty at times, but that makes every encounter all the more memorable. The combat is challenging, and when paired with the survival mechanics can make for an engaging game which will keep you on your toes and almost force you to craft and hoard potions and other restorative items. This in turn creates a problem with carrying capacity. I feel like the player interests are very well balanced and you will constantly be faced with choices. Do I take this item? Do I fight this enemy? And various others. The game seems to be similar to other RPGs from the past, but somehow manages to simultaneously feel unique. The main issue I have is one that we often see with more complicated games. They tend to leave the tutorials to the community. You do get a tutorial in the game, but it simply does not explain everything sufficiently. If you plan on playing this game, I strongly advise you watch a few beginner guides on YouTube. This literally made the difference between us giving up on the game and playing it for 60 hours. There's a lot here, but it's not wrapped up in a nice neat package with a bow waiting for the player to open and enjoy its contents. No, instead you are expected to experiment and hit your head against the wall until you have figured everything out. But once that moment comes, once it all clicks, the experience completely changes. The game suddenly feels fun and rewarding as hell. Outward is clearly targeting more hardcore RPG fans. You need to be someone who is okay with making baby steps for a while before the true journey begins. Neither its graphics nor its story or lack of proper voice acting will be inviting here. You come strictly for the RPG experience. I strongly advise anyone who considers playing this game to have a friend ready to join them on this journey. As with most difficult things, they're both easier and more enjoyable in a team. I hope my review was helpful and informative. Let me know if you've tried the game and what you think of it. I always appreciate talking to my viewers, so don't be shy and leave a comment. In any case, thanks for watching and have a great day.